This is Tao Unbound, the English language podcast of Tel Aviv University. Please welcome your host, Ido Aharoni, Tel Aviv University's graduate, member of the Board of Governors, lecturer, writer, and veteran diplomat.
Welcome to another episode of Tao Unbound. I'm Ido Aharoni, your host from Tel Aviv, and it is my great pleasure and privilege to host in our studio today Professor Eyal Chowers. And we'll talk about that last name. Welcome to our studio.
Thank you.
Professor Chowers is a political scientist at Tel Aviv University. His book, The Political Philosophy of Zionism, Trading Jewish Words for a Hebraic Land, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2012. His specialty is politics and language. He deals a lot with the history of Zionism, with political philosophy. He deals a lot with the issue of power and politics, the balance between power and politics, and all those things we'll discuss, both on the theoretical level and how it really translates in practice on the ground, not only in Israel, but also in the United States, in Europe, and other places, especially with the rise of populism. But before anything, we always begin with a series of personal questions. So tell us a little bit about your upbringing, where you're from, and we're very interested in the history of your family name.
Okay, so thank you again for inviting me, Ido. I was born in a village called Bet Zayit. It's near Jerusalem, and I actually still live there. It was a village, a moshav, and it was a process of, for me, to get to know the world of higher education, starting from moshav, which is not, how should I say, a very intellectual environment, or natural intellectual environment. But I gradually realized that what interests me is really, how should I say, the life of the mind, as Hannah Arendt called it. And I studied at the Hebrew University, both philosophy and political science, did 2 degrees.
Did you do your high school in Jerusalem also?
Yes, I did it in Boyer, actually, in Jerusalem.
Oh.
And then I, went to the army, did the military service, and then went to the university. I went to the university after the first Lebanon War. It was early 80s. And I think that part of what drove me there to the particular field of political science and philosophy was the war and the experiences that I had in the war, and realizing how important ideas are for shaping our reality, especially political ideas. So I did my first degree in political science and philosophy, which I really thought gave me the footing to continue in that path and reflecting about my reality and our reality. And I later did my PhD at McGill University in Canada, and studied with 2 philosophers, who were very well-known Canadian philosophers, Charles Taylor and James Tully. And at the time, it was really an excellent place to study political philosophy. And I later came back to Tel Aviv University.
Do you still maintain connection to McGill?
Not that much, unfortunately. They both left the university. Both my advisors left the university, and so I have less interactions with McGill at the moment.
No, when I think of the 1982 First Lebanon War, when Israel invaded Lebanon after a very lengthy period of terrorist attack emanating from southern Lebanon, and I see this as a turning point in the positioning of Israel in the world, and especially in the positioning of Israel among world Jews. Do you agree with that analysis?
What do you mean? Could you explain?
So until that point, Israel firmly occupied the position of the underdog. Once Israel initiated a war we lost the positioning of the underdog. And we entered this whole new territory where, in the eyes of many people, the underdog is always right. And therefore, since we are not the underdog, we're always wrong. Might versus right, if you may, politically. And that's the new unknown territory that we entered in 1982 unknowingly, not even realizing what are the implications for Israel's positioning. And it's been downhill ever since, in my view.
It's funny that you use this term because one of my experiences in the war was coming back for a vacation, a break from the war for 24 hours, and I read the Haaretz newspaper, and there was this article by Zev Sternhal. I don't know if you remember his name.
Of course. His daughter was right here as one of our guests.
And he wrote an article, but the title was Boker Tov Lach Imperia, Good Morning Empire. Exactly what you mentioned. This is the first war that Israel thinks of itself as an empire. And he really criticized this new position of Israel in the area, in the Middle East. And I identified with what you wrote there. And this was really the article that one of the reasons why I chose to study political philosophy. I said, this, not the particular position, but the way, which I agreed, as I said, but the ability to reflect on reality in a deeper sense. And he had the tools and the ability and the intellect, of course, to do that. And I think it was a very important position at the time. Now, regarding whether Israel changed its status in the Middle East because of this war, I fully agree. But I think it maybe took the wrong turn and used its power in ways which I think were problematic, both internally and externally. Both didn't know how to act as a power in Lebanon, and at the same time fractured the Israeli society. And the fracture that we see today, people say, and I'm not the only one, people who experienced that war at that time, some people see kind of the breakdown of Israeli society starting there. And kind of what's happening today in Israel is an echo in some ways of what happened in 82 and how the Israeli society was divided around the war and the different reaction to the war. So, I think there are some continuities between that moment and this moment.
Now, you wrote a very, in my view, very important article about a year ago in which you're talking about how Zionism basically diverted from its original mission and changed the balance between power and the desire to acquire power for the sake of power, and the ability to set forth a long-term vision. So you mentioned, for example, that Winston Churchill was able to galvanize the British people because he spoke about, let's defend freedom. But here you say something happened. Something happened after 10/7. We're talking about power for the sake of power.
Right. I think maybe I should mention a few points regarding...
Yeah, that's the whole point. Yeah.
Okay. So the first point, as you mentioned, is that power became more and more the dominant conversation or language in Israeli politics. And you see the term becoming more and more popular, permeating the way we speak about politics and about the state and about the goal of the state. I think the main figure in that transformation is Prime Minister Netanyahu, who used the word power in very complex and in different contexts, speaking about economic power, military power, diplomatic power, and so on, but coaching everything in terms of power. And I think that's problematic because power should be, obviously any state needs power, but it usually has a higher goal than power itself. Power is a means to some end. the end should be, especially in democratic society, should be some kind of ethical end. And what's happened in Israeli politics is that the moral ends of the state and of the society kind of receded into the background, whereas the notion of power became the dominant thing. And as I mentioned there in the essay, a party like Otzma Yehudit or Jewish Power of the Ben-Gvir party, it's not only a name, it's a vision that this is what is important. And today, I think this is the dominant power in the right in Israel today. What Ben-Gvir symbolizes, because I think he expresses a vision that many people on the right, not only from his party, identify with. And I see a very clear example for how the moral language as I said, receded in the nationality law. The nationality law of 2018, where all the values that were in the Declaration of Independence, like justice and peace and equality, and especially freedom, were not mentioned in the nationality law, not mentioned as characteristic of the state and as ends of the state, which the nation state should accomplish and try to strive for. So in this is a very clear example where, as a basic law that defines the nature of the state or the character of the state, does not use ethical language.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very worrisome development. I would just say one more point. What's happening in authoritarian regimes is that the notion of power of the state kind of meshes with the power of the leader. And there is a notion that we need, in order to have a strong state, we need a strong leader. The strong leader takes credit for building a strong state and vice versa. And I think that this language also became more and more popular in Israel, and I think it's very problematic.
Now, the question that I'd like to present to you as a political scientist is to what do you attribute this? This is a change in the Israeli society. It's a social change. When did it start? I remember we're the same generation. I also served in Lebanon in 1982, and I remember as a young man how I cringed when I heard Menachem Begin threatening Assad. Janusz and Raful are waiting for you. And I said to myself, this guy is detached from reality. What is he talking about? And then, of course, he went after the Beaufort famous battle and asked Ariel Sharon if our guys had guns, if we had machine guns, which, of course, exposed how detached he was from reality. And so I saw this as a display of like the frightened person who's whistling in the dark, right? Singing in the dark, as a display of insecurity, actually. The state law of 2018, in my view, is a display of insecurity.
You could read it this way as well. I'm not sure. I think it's sometimes, the contradictions live side by side. And on the one hand, it's a language of power, and it's a language of try to dominate the state and different aspects of the state, like the language. At the same time, you could say that it covers kind of insecurity. I don't think it's necessarily mutually exclusive. Sometimes, it's a complex game of insecurity and over security. But I think it's hard for me to say where it started, whether it started in 82 or later. I think it's many different aspects. I wrote about Zionism from philosophical perspective, and I think in some way it was problematic from the beginning. because Zionism, especially socialist Zionists, and not only them, put a very high emphasis on transforming concrete reality. Zionism measured itself in terms of how much land it has, how many people live in the country, how many houses were built, what was the status of the economy, the army, etc. It was a very concrete-oriented political philosophy and approach. And in some way, the more abstract, the more, how should I say, the more ethical dimension of human life and what is the good life and what is the good society, this kind of questions were not asked enough because of the emphasis on concrete reality and building a state. That's what it meant. So it was, the problem was, I think, as I said at the beginning, that's why I gave my book a title from words from the Hebrew language to the Hebraic Land. But I think it kind of developed over time. Over time, the problem that was there at the beginning became more and more pronounced. And that's what we see today. Of course, there are many other reasons, like what happened, the occupation, the occupied territories, and many other reasons that pushed Israel in that direction. But as I said, I think the problem originated in how Zionism was in a way founded to create a state. And by doing that, as Bialik already saw at the beginning of Zionism, it kind of didn't put enough emphasis on asking questions about what makes human life worthy to live and what is the best way to live as human beings and as a society.
It's interesting you say that because, I read a lot about Ben Gurion, and there's no doubt in my mind he was fully aware of this tension. But given the really extraordinary number of physical, external, existential threats, he had to put an emphasis on the security consideration. And the security consideration became so dominant that it didn't really leave oxygen in the room for any other consideration. And he was acutely aware of that. He was acutely aware of it, but nevertheless, that's exactly what happened. Now, let me ask you a different question. So you studied a lot about the early influences on Zionism. And obviously Zionism, when you compare Zionism to other national movements, was a big success, right? It had a strategy to create a state, and the state indeed was created. Now we're talking about the failure of the state to depict or to paint a different horizon, a different, a future worth living for, right? Something to aspire to. Okay, that's a different conversation. But what are the early influences that you could detect on the Zionist thought that came from non-Jews? I know that you gave a very interesting talk, which I urge all of our listeners to watch, about Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his influence on Zionism. Although it was not mainstream influence, yet it was some influence. What other types of influences you can share with us?
Obviously, socialism was a very important influence, and nationalism. And these influences were created, the dominant languages in the early Zionism. And I think, they're quite familiar to most people who follow political thought. What I think was unique to Zionism, I would mention just a few things. One is cultural Zionism from Echad Ha'am, which tried to combine or to kind of create continuity between the Jewish tradition as it developed in the diaspora and Zionism. And their emphasis was on culture and language and morality as it developed in the diaspora. They were very fearful of a break between the tradition and Zionism. And they tried to kind of reduce the break that the Zionist revolution created.
But he did insist on Hebrew.
Echad Ha'am, of course, did. Herzl didn't.
I know.
But Echad Ha'am really emphasized the role of Hebrew, and the Hebrew University was founded as an expression of his idea of a spiritual center in Palestine, in historic Palestine. That was the idea that Zionism is about creating a renewed Hebrew culture in Palestine so that it will infuse the life of Jews in the diaspora and the Jews here. The idea of the state was not central to that vision, and even there was apprehension about creating a Jewish state. This was very important intellectually, even though from a numerical perspective, not many people followed that vision. That was a unique feature of Zionism, and I think it influenced us in many ways intellectually. Another tradition that I explored in that lecture is the tradition of republicanism that comes from Rousseau as one of the thinkers that developed the idea of modern republicanism. But I try to distinguish between the republicanism of Rousseau and the republicanism of Zionism, which, as I said earlier, it was a republicanism that was oriented towards transforming the material world and creating citizens which are builders, pioneers, and people who are committed to nation building. And this is something that we don't find in Rousseau. So on the one hand, there is a sense of solidarity, of community, of a strong sense of patriotism that comes from the Republican tradition. But on the other hand, this republicanism is oriented towards nation building and therefore doesn't pay enough attention to the other dimension of politics, as I mentioned, of politics as centered around collectively exploring what is the good life and how we create the best human beings that we can create.
And the next thing that comes to mind when you talk about that is the crisis that we experienced here in 2023 with the attempt of the government to achieve a level of unrestricted power, which is really at the core of this political maneuver. And the question that I ask myself is, how come so many Israelis either don't care or don't understand what it means to live under impaired democracy or under a government that has unrestricted power? And then the question is, what are the underlying social currents that allow that to happen?
It's many different aspects. It's a very complex, I see it as a very important and very complex question. Of course, there are certain segments of the Israeli society who are never exposed to civic democratic education, like the Haredim. And you can expect them to understand the basic about what democracy means if it feels so disengaged from the state. So this is one aspect. Another aspect is how the undemocratic way of thinking penetrated Israeli society, which we discussed a little bit before. And I would say, arguably, that the military form of government as a way of ruling people in the West Bank penetrated into the Israeli society and is shaping its democracy. Why? Because military rule has a structure defined by international law, right? It's a system of governing people without separation of powers. The military is both the military commander is both the legislator and the executive branch, right? The military commander combines both authorities in one, and the judges, of course, are military judges that are part of the military hierarchy, even if they are fair and decent human beings, but they aren't under the authority of the military. So you don't have, in this structure of government, separation of power. Now, after many decades of, exercising this type of government over many people, and many Jews in the West Bank are exposed to it too, and many people operate this system. I mean, we who serve in the military, who served in the past, or children and so on, serve in the military, we are all the time exercising this system of government, and it's part of the way we think. Is it surprising that it finally reshapes Israel from within? Is it this system of government really can be over there and not over here? I think this is another source. And lastly, I would say something that is uncomfortable for us, and this is about the university. The universities themselves in Israel, I think we should, take responsibility for our part. The universities in Israel did not pay enough attention for democratic education. And until the last 2 years, it was not an important part of the conversation inside the university. There were no classes that tried to reach all students, not only political science, of course, students in every field at the university should have a chance or should be encouraged to know more about democracy. This is fundamental to the Israeli society and to our values and to our history. And we didn't do that. And from personal experience, I was involved in one or two struggles to try to broaden the democratic education in the universities, and it didn't happen. The university did not realize how important it is in time. Luckily now, we are voicing a strong position in regard to saving democracy in Israel, and we are doing some very important actions as universities and individuals in the university. But I wish it would have happened a decade ago.
The question is, and I agree with you about the spillover effect. The question, I think, is much bigger, and one of your areas of specialty is the role of academia and society. And I'd like, this is an opportunity for me to ask you a question about what's happening in the United States today in academia, especially post 10/7. And I teach in the United States in universities. I teach in New York, I teach in San Diego and other places. And I'm invited to lecture in many universities, and I just had an unpleasant incident with some people that try to suppress my freedom of speech in the name of freedom of speech. And you see an effort in many universities in the name of inclusion to exclude Jews and Asians and others and so on and so forth. And then you have President Trump, who's decided to wage war against this whole, let's call it DEI culture. For those of you who don't know what DEI is, I'll explain. It's a whole system that basically is designed to equalize the injustices of the past, or at least the perceived injustices of the past, and so on. Question is, are the universities are fulfilling their main purpose of allowing students to engage in deep and meaningful learning, or they have become platforms for social engineering?
You ask about the United States or about Israel?
United States.
You know the university better than me. I wonder what is your opinion. I would say that I think there is a great transformation that happened there in the last maybe 15, 20 years. From what I hear and from what I read, it's not the same universities that I used to know. And when I went to a conference a few years ago, I was a little bit surprised to see how homogeneous the view was regarding Israel and Palestine. It was a conference on Israel, Palestine, and Zionism. I was very surprised to see that all the researchers that were there more or less adhere to the vision of Zionism, or the notion that Zionism is a colonial settler state. I didn't realize that this became a kind of the common. Yeah, I didn't realize that. That was not the case 20 years ago. Something happened. So I don't know about, different areas of research that are not related to what I do. But in my field, Zionism, I did see a kind of process where it became less pluralistic, and people holding into some of conventional thought and not willing to ask hard questions. And that was pretty depressing.
Yeah, well, Zionism is only one aspect of it, and I totally agree with you. Zionism became like almost a toxic word in certain departments. But even, I teach about the marketing of nations, and in one class I was praising the United States as a brand in terms of its ability to produce knowledge that saves people's lives, like medical breakthroughs and so on. And it was one student so angry that I was saying good things about America that student walked out of the classroom. They couldn't handle it. So it's not just against Zionism, it's against America, it's against the West. And the question is, what are the roots of it? I trace it all the way back to the big trauma of World War II, with the massive suffering that Europe and Asia endured, not only them. And the reaction was, let's view the world through the eyes of the underdog, and that very quickly became the victim's always right, and the whole philosophy of might versus right.
I think I agree. I agree also about the timing, in a way. One of the texts which I think is very important in that regard, I don't know if you are familiar with Walter Benjamin, the Jewish philosopher, literary critic.
Who committed suicide.
Right, committed suicide during World War II. One of his most famous texts is called the Thesis on the Philosophy of History. And I think it was written in 1940. And he writes there that history has been written until then by the victors. Whoever wins the battle, whoever wins, whatever situation there is, he or she is able to write the history of what happened. And this, writes Benjamin, should change. And we should start write history about the people who didn't have a voice, who their history, their suffering was not discussed and not mentioned in the history books. And the new history that he calls for is one that will focus on these neglected classes and groups of people, whether it's gays or women or Jews or other groups or Black American, blacks in general, Black Americans specifically, groups that have really been kind of not only oppressed, but did not even have a memory, not share in the collective memory. And there is a Jewish dimension to it. How do we do tikkun? How do we, try to redeem their lives? We redeem their lives by telling their story, telling their history, giving them presence in our collective memory. And part of what happened is that after a certain point, especially in the last 25 years or so, the attention of scholars around the world, not only historians, turned into the story of colonialism. This is the story that we should tell. Who suffered from colonialism? the West has been dominant in the world because of colonialism and imperialism. Many people suffered all over the globe because of this phenomenon. And scholars started to write the history of colonialism, both in North America and in Africa, Asia, and so on. We are part of this story. Zionism today is seen as one of the last vestiges of colonialism in the world. So we are seen in the context of the West trying to come to grips or to terms with its own past and correct what has been done, whether it's just for us or not.
Where is the role of archaeology? Because archaeology proves beyond any doubt that the Jews are actually as indigenous to this region as any other people.
It's true. And we have the history, very...
I have my own DNA to prove it. My family, turns out, never left the region.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
From where?
My mother's from Yemen. My father's from Uzbekistan.
I see. And the Yemenites lives... was very continuous Yemenite process and presence in Palestine since when?
Not in Palestine, in the region, in the Middle East. In the Middle East. So the DNA study doesn't give you a specific location. It just says the Caucasus, or you can say Persia, or the Middle East. Okay. So my family never left the Middle East.
Mine did. But when it's uncomfortable facts, you just push them away. And in many ways, I have many reasons to criticize Zionism, as I talked here, and also a supporter of Zionism. It's a question of which facet of Zionism. But I think when the facts don't fit the mold, they're just pushed away. One is that Jews always had some presence or connection to Palestine. Another is that there was no empire behind us, like in most
colonialists.
Yeah, and another fact is that many Jews were just refugees and didn't have an option. All this is usually not put in the center of the discussion by people who advocate the theory of settler colonialism. And I think it's a problem.
Yeah, it's a big problem, and I don't know what's the solution. And I'm not sure that what Trump is trying to do now is the solution, because I think he's trying to overthrow the baby with the water in many, many cases. And I do understand that there's a problem in humanities, there's a problem in social studies, but why should the life sciences suffer for it?
I agree.
That's a big question that I ask. In any event, listen, this has been a fascinating conversation. I'd like to ask you to return to have another conversation, maybe after the geopolitical circumstances will change. And I wanted to thank you for taking the time to educate us and share with us your vast knowledge.
Thank you very much.
And to our viewers and listeners back home, goodbye from Tel Aviv until our next episode.